Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're here with Erica Bauermeister and Isabel Iman again for our second in our Supper Club series, the Dinner With series. PSA for tomorrow is Jamie Curl, who is a local baker. Her book is Baking Gold. I also would like to do a little PSA for 45th Parallel Wine Shop. Matt sold me this lovely bottle of white. I don't even know what variety it is, but I picked it because of the goat on the label. I love it. So I'm going to turn it over to Isabel, and thank you everybody for joining.
Amazing. Thank you, Christine. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the second evening of our Supper Club series. For those of you joining us for the first time tonight, like Christine said, I'm Isabel Iman. I'm a local Portland writer and food blogger. And just thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this virtual gathering. So tonight I am absolutely thrilled to welcome one of my favorite authors, Erica Bauermeister. Erica is the New York Times bestselling author of 4 novels, and the most recent of which, The Scent Keeper, came out in May of 2019. And you also came out with your memoir, House Lessons, in March of this year. I will admit I probably read all of your books at least 4 times. They're just beautiful. I think I was 13 when I picked up Joy for Beginners the first time and just fell in love from there. So just having the opportunity to interview you and to get to chat with you tonight is just such an honor. So thank you.
Thank you. 13? Oh my gosh. I didn't think it came out that long ago. Oh, you're very, very young and really mature. I'm not sure.
I just loved it. Yeah. So a couple housekeeping things before we start. Tonight's event, our discussion is going to last about 45 minutes, and we're going to save time for questions at the end. If you do have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And there's also the Ask a Question function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll get to those at the end. So without further ado, are you ready, Erica?
Sure thing.
Awesome. Let's do it. So I wanted to start kind of generally speaking about your writing, because I think something that I'm so drawn to as the reader is the fact that you're able to involve and evoke all of the senses in your writing. Your books are just truly a fully immersive experience. And I'm curious if the way that you write is indicative of how you experience the world. In wanting to write and to be a writer, was it also your desire to give written voice to sort of your unique perspective while also nodding to sort of these universal truths of the world?
Well, I've always been an observer. I was the 4th of 4 daughters, which meant and I was the youngest of those 4. And then I had a little brother later, and I spent a lot of time watching people, because I was an introvert. I was the kid in the back of the station wagon with the book, listening to my sisters, talking or fighting in the middle seat. And so I spent a lot of time on those, what I always call the liminal spaces, where people aren't talking or where things are happening that people aren't paying attention to. And I think that is where the senses come in. And one of the things I love about writing is that it's a chance for me to really slow down. I'm not a good meditator, but it's a lot like meditation, where you slow down and you really pay attention. And I almost always write about something that's subliminal, something that we're not paying attention to. So food and School of Essential Ingredients, those kind of small fears that are intertwined into us with Joy for Beginners. The sense of smell for Scent Keeper, and the psychology of architecture and space for House Lessons. But each time it's this thing that I'm watching, I'm seeing, and I'm noticing that other people aren't paying as much attention. And so I want them to focus, I guess, would be the way to look at it.
Yeah. Is there a sense that you feel most connected to?
Good question. I love the sense of smell. So writing The Scent Keeper was really fun, and that also explains a lot about food and cooking. And when I started to learn how to cook without recipes and how to cook without timers and smelling when the cookies were done and smelling when the sauce was ready and those kind of things that really altered how I approached life. So in many ways, I would say this sense of smell. But I had an accident with bear spray a couple of years back, and so I lost most of my sense of smell for a long time.
Wow.
So I've had to fight pretty hard to get it back.
Yeah.
And so that's made me appreciate it, I guess, even more.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah. It was actually the weekend I decided to start writing The Scent Keeper. We were backpacking on the West Coast Trail, and the bear spray went off in the tent. And just nuked it.
My goodness.
Nuked it for weeks. So yeah.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's wild. So speaking more than specifically about food in your writing, the way you describe food is just stunning, and you give so much care to the description and the appearance and the flavor of the foods and the dishes in your books, but you also seem to give an equal, if not more, of a focus to your characters' relationship to food and how they interact with it and how they respond to it, as well as like how it influences and drives their actions. What inspired you to explore and write about food in this way?
Well, we lived in Italy for 2 years. That had a big effect on how I approached food. Before that, I was very recipe based, and moving to Italy, that really changed that, opened it up, made cooking more like poetry and less like prose. And I really liked that aspect of it.
Yeah.
And so when we moved back to the United States, which was in 1999, and the foodie thing just wasn't quite as big here. And so there wasn't a natural community. So I took a cooking class, and we killed crabs with our bare hands. Just like Claire does in the book.
Yeah.
I'm not Claire. That's not my life. But I always have to, like, male readers are like, did you have sex in the backyard? Like, the sprinklers are going. It's like, no, I'm not Claire. Stop it. But anyway, but I did kill crabs with my bare hands. And it was this strange, intimate, visceral activity that was nothing I expected to do. And yet here I was doing it with a group of strangers. And I thought, wow, that is so weird. What would happen if you kept this group of strangers together for, say, 8 months, right? And each of the characters had their own food that would change their life. Because this was the first time I'd ever really thought about writing fiction. And as soon as I got that idea for the book, it just fell into my head. And characters started showing up. I'd never had fictional characters in my head before. And all of a sudden, these people are populating my dreams. They're showing up while I'm walking. Their stories are just kind of unfolding in my mind. You know, I'm in my mid-40s, and it's the weirdest thing that's ever happened. I suddenly have imaginary friends. My family is nonplussed. But it was as if getting the structure for this book was like building a house, and each character knew they had a room to move into, and so they started showing up. But what was important to me was that each character would have their food that would take them to the next place in their life. The way that crabs had I always said they shocked me into fiction, you know? And so when people say, oh, can food really affect your life? It's like, yes, it can. It changed the entire course of my career, killing a crab. So what was really interesting was, as each character showed up in my head, then I had to think, okay, what's the food that matches that person? And what's the lesson they need to learn? And how is this food going to help them get there? And it was such a fascinating puzzle. You know, some of them were immediate. You know, Tom would be pasta sauce because it had to be something that took a long time, that you made it from scratch, you made it by hand. He's just finished caretaking his wife who has died after a long illness. And you can choose to see that as a waste of your time, or you can choose to see that as a gift. And pasta from scratch is the exact same way. It'll take you all freaking day, and people will eat it in 15 or 20 minutes. And you can choose to see that as a waste of your time or a gift. And so it made a lot of sense. Other characters, it didn't come as naturally or as quickly. It took a lot more thought. But each time I wanted to have that, where the kind of the metaphorical aspects of the dish would lead them to that place they needed to go.
Yeah. I love too, just the way you're describing that. It feels so cyclical in that, like, it can both start from the food, but it can also start from whatever the character is experiencing in their life, and they both inform one another.
Yes. And I love the idea of this kind of magical chef who could intuit what they needed and take them to the
Yes,
next place.
absolutely. I know. I always, when reading that book, I see Lillian sort of as this like fairy godmother looking down upon all of them. But it's interesting too, because in the beginning of the book, you give voice to the fact that she's had that experience as well in her life. And she started off in a place where she wasn't quite so privy to the power of food in that way.
No, yeah.
So speaking of that scene where Claire kills the crab, I just think that is one of my favorite parts of the book. So I have the School of Essential Ingredients right here. Would you mind if I read that passage a little bit? I just have to. It is so wonderful. The leathery petals of the crab's lungs came loose between Claire's fingers and flowed away with the cold water. As she stood at the sink, Claire's body was shivering, and yet, and this ran counter to everything she thought about herself, deeply stirred. It was like jumping off the high diving board when you believed you couldn't, hitting the cold water and feeling it fly over your hot skin. Claire the bank teller, Claire the mother. She would have never killed a crab. But then again, Claire thought these days she was a lot of things she didn't recognize. I just love that. I think it felt like each chapter with the characters' experiences with whatever recipe or food they're working with, they all seem to reach sort of this climactic point where they come to understand that the food is informing their experience in this way. And I feel like that's the exact moment where Claire discovers that. So I guess you kind of touched upon this a little bit, but was it always your goal to develop your characters in this way?
Yeah, it really was. And the thing with Claire and the crabs, I mean, I remember when I realized that she needed to have the crabs. And I thought, that is the weirdest combination, violence and motherhood. Why would you put those two things together, you know? And yet I realized there's a lot of, not violent like abuse, but I mean the physical act of having a child is violent. It is disruptive. It is physically painful. And what happens to kind of the core of yourself when you become a parent. And, you know, I think that there is a breaking apart that happens there. It's like ripping the shell off something. And so many of the images of killing the crabs had a great deal to do with what she was going through herself. And it was kind of interesting because I started out writing memoirs, and one of the memoirs I wrote, many of them, they weren't published, but I wrote one about being a young mother. And I was told that mothers didn't read, which shows you how long ago that was. But, you know, they said it wasn't personal enough. And what was interesting was when I started writing fiction and when I was writing Claire's story, I was able to write about motherhood in a way I had never been able to write about it as a 32-year-old mother. I just couldn't go that deep. But somehow through Claire's lens, I was able to go there. And that entire, you know, everything that it took to write that 120-page memoir kind of went into those 2 pages of Claire's story. And honestly, I get more letters about those 2 pages than probably anything I've ever written.
I love it.
It just speaks to motherhood. I've had women, I had a woman, 65-year-old woman, write me and say, I just read this aloud to my husband. He finally understands. Wow. And it was like, wow, okay, now we're done. I'm just done. I don't need to do anything else.
Well, I think that's wonderful too, because you talk about these 120 pages that you worked on of the memoir, and it all gets condensed down into this project and this book that you weren't ever really anticipating happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. As a writer, I mean, that's just the thing, is you just don't know. You know, you're writing a book, you think something's going to happen to it, and often it goes in a completely different direction. Either the book itself or that part of your career ends up informing a later part.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that it took me 6 years to write the School of Essential Ingredients meant that that whole foodie culture was really hitting the zeitgeist right when I was selling the book or trying to get the book sold. If I had been faster, if I had written it 4 years earlier, it probably wouldn't have sold. They probably would have said people don't want to read about food, you know, just like they had said mothers don't read. So a lot of it can be timing too.
Right. Yeah. Have you ever sort of fallen into the trap of thinking that something that doesn't immediately materialize or doesn't go in the direction that you want it to go in, it's a waste? Or have you always been able to sort of have that insight that it's going to turn into something, even if it doesn't initially seem like what
I mean, there were those 15 years when I was writing and not getting published. It often felt like it was for nothing, because I was just getting rejected over and over and over again. And it wasn't really until after that I realized that all of those books that weren't published that I wrote, what they were doing was teaching me the craft of writing, so that when I got old enough and mature enough to have the realizations, which I think are one of the hallmarks of what I write, is, exactly what you were talking about, is that life moment that each of these characters has in relation to the food, that willingness to dive into who we are as people. I couldn't have written those at 32, but what I could do at 32 is teach myself how to write a good sentence, and teach myself what a metaphor was, and how to pace a book or how to pace a sentence. And so by the time I got to my mid 40s and I had some ideas worth writing down, my skill level was up to my maturity, and they kind of came together at the right point. So for me, the timing was kind of perfect, but those 15 years felt really long.
I'm sure you're happy to look back on them now.
I'm happy to look back on them. I am. That's a great way to put it.
So you talked a little bit about your approach to cooking, that you worked up to getting to this place where you're not quite using recipes anymore. You're not really measuring things out. I'm curious what your opinions are on recipes. Like, as cooks, should we first learn the fundamental steps of creating a dish and then sort of let our senses guide the way with ingredients from there, or are you okay with recipes?
I think recipes are like the grammar. It's like you have to learn grammar in order to break it successfully. And so I think using recipes is great. And for some people, that's where they will always stay. They will always be happy with recipes, because to them, it's kind of like a communication with another person. It's like cooking with another person in the room. And for me, though, I was brought up, we had a pretty Germanic household. There was a lot of opportunity to do things wrong and right, and judgment. And so for me, recipes were another chance to do something wrong. And I just wasn't interested in that. And so when we moved to Italy and there were no recipes, there was feel the weight in your hand, smell it when it's done. Think about the ingredients as personalities that might talk well with each other, that to me was incredibly liberating, because there was no wrong way to do it. It tastes better, it tastes worse, but there was no wrong. And so that naturally worked for me. But I would never say there's one right way to do it. Absolutely not. I know so many great cooks that reliably stick with cookbooks, and I love them as springboards. I love to look at a recipe and go, oh, okay, now I'm going to play with that.
Right.
But I almost always start with someone else's idea.
I think the way of cooking, though, that you're describing it lends itself really nicely to literature, because it's so romantic in that you're sort of developing this really intimate relationship with the ingredients and then feeling inspired by them and going from there.
Well, and it also allowed me to play. I mean, it was one of my most interesting back and forth with a reader that I've ever had. Was this reader who wrote me an email, and the subject line was, have you ever actually cooked a cake from scratch? And I thought, oh, this one's going to be interesting, because every once in a while someone will write and they'll take issue with, how Lillian cooked something, cooking pasta sauce all day long or whatever it is, And I did a tremendous amount of research for every single thing. I did 6 months of research into the chemistry of cake, because I can't bake cake at all. And when I realized that Carl and Helen needed a cake, I was very upset, because that meant I had to learn how to bake cakes. But anyway, so I get this email, and she says, it's not a white cake. You have egg yolks in it. It's a yellow cake. And on top of that, you use baking soda instead of baking powder, and you need baking powder for a fluffy cake. And so I wrote her back and I said, okay, so look, here's the thing. I write fiction. And that doesn't mean that you can't bake this cake. It's actually a great cake. Book clubs bake it all the time. You can find the recipes on my website, by the way. And for those people that were dying for recipes in the book. But I said, the reason why I did it, and thank God you're a close reader, but I put the eggs in because Carl and Helen are a married couple of long duration, and it has not always gone smoothly or well. And here they are getting the wedding cake they never got, but they're not a white, fluffy, virginal couple. It wouldn't be appropriate to give them the cake for a 22-year-old.
Mhm.
And so, yes, there are yolks in the cake. And yes, I wanted a cake that was denser and more sensual and had more depth and texture to it. And so, yeah, I put in baking soda instead of baking powder. And she wrote back and she goes, "Oh my God, you thought about all that stuff?" And I'm like, "Yes, we do." And from now on, look in there. And, when an author does something like that, first consider, did they do it on purpose? And then think about, okay, maybe that isn't actually literally possible, but first err on the side of, ooh, maybe it's creative,
What an email to receive.
Oh, it was amazing. It was amazing because, initially my reaction was, what? And then I thought, no, this is going to be really fun, And she wrote back and said, this is great. I'm going to do the cake. So
that's amazing. I think on the topic too of just research for fiction, your books are, I was reading, when I first read The Scent Keeper, I was just marveling at how much research you must have done. I don't know the extent of what you did research or for how long, but just as a reader, I can't even imagine how much you must have looked into. Is there sort of like an average time you spend researching your books, or just
years? Usually what happens is I get interested in an idea, and then I'll spend a couple years reading it, kind of background reading while I'm working on another book. And so that allows it to kind of simmer on the back burner. And that's when the characters start to show up that match what I'm learning. But every book that I do, I try to pick a topic that I want to learn about. And I try to pick a kind of a structural challenge in terms of the writing itself, because every time I want to learn something new. I mean, I've never really stopped being a student. So, the book I'm working on right now, I'm learning about freediving, and I'm learning about leap seconds, and I'm learning about weird animal facts and homeless kids. And, I love that. That makes it interesting for me.
How do you pick something to get interested in? Does it just fall upon you?
Sometimes it's walking in a bookstore. I love independent bookstores because you walk in and there's some odd book that you didn't expect. And all of a sudden you think, there's a story in that, So this book of this compendium of odd animal facts, I thought someday that's going to come in handy. And I have a character who loves odd animal facts, and it fits her perfectly,
There's a character for everything.
And Atlas Obscura, if you don't know Atlas Obscura, it is a wonderful source of bizarre ideas. And they usually get me going.
I love it. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, it's great.
So bringing it back to food and cooking, just again, generally, how do you see food, cooking, eating, and gathering around meals as being more largely connected to how we live, and not just how we spend our time in the kitchen or at the table, but just really every single second of our lives?
And it's just so, just thinking about that right now could make you cry, because we just all want to be doing this so badly. And we have this tradition in our family. I write about it at the end of House Lessons. It's called Pasta Fest, and it's kind of our Italian version of Thanksgiving, which is different than the one that's in School of Essential Ingredients. But what we basically do is get together and make pasta all day long. We have a multi-course dinner, and every single course is pasta, and we've done them all by hand. And we've been doing it for probably, 15 years now. And, it's a family, non-family kind of event. We get 20 plus people all sitting around working on it. And it's just the most glorious holiday. I love it. And, someone asked me recently, what public spaces do you miss during the pandemic? And I said, well, yeah, obviously movie theaters, restaurants. And I said, but I miss the public spaces of my house. I miss having people in my house, in my kitchen, in my dining room, in my living room. That's what I want back, as soon as I can. That's what I want back.
You're going to make me cry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Me too. So we'll both do it together. It's fine.
Yeah. No, I feel the same way. I love that tradition, though, of a pasta dinner. I'm curious what dessert ends up being usually.
Oh, well, so one of my son's middle school friends ended up being a terrific baker, and he brings a coconut cream pie and this rum cake that has an entire bottle of rum in it.
Oh my
God. It's so good.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting to think about the things that you want back in your life after it's taken away from you so suddenly and so abruptly. Yeah. And it's these simple things, these simple gatherings that just mean so much, you know? Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We were talking a little bit about the time that you spent in Italy, and I feel like for me, reading through The School of Essential Ingredients, The Lost Art of Mixing, before I learned that you lived in Italy for 2 years, I was much vibes. But I also think just the sensuality of Italian cooking is so present in those books. I'm curious though, like, did you feel that you were sort of specifically deviating away from American food culture, or at least our idea of American food culture, or does that play into those books as
well? It felt very much like I was deviating back in 1997 when we went to Italy.
Yeah,
it did. And even when we came back, I don't think it would feel so much like that now. I think we've really adopted so much of the I would call it slower food movement. And maybe that's because we're in the Pacific Northwest, right, where we are a little more of a foodie culture. Every once in a while I go back to Missouri where my in-laws are, and it's like, oh, right, fried donuts. I get that, you know, fried pie and fried pickles. But even there, I mean, man, the foodie thing has really happened, and our appreciation of, you know, just slowing down and making sure the ingredients are good and from local farmers. And, you know, it's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to read another passage again. Do you mind people reading from your books out loud?
No, I love it. I love it. While you do that, I'm going to take 1 second because I can hear my phone dinging, and I don't know if you can, but I'm going to go turn that sucker off.
You go for it.
So you read, and I'll be right back.
Awesome. Well, I'll share with everybody. I recently reread Erica's book, Joy for Beginners. And if you haven't read this yet, pick it up immediately. It is truly a comfort of a book and incredibly inspiring. And I don't know about anybody else, but I received a sourdough starter at the beginning of quarantine. And as a result of that, I developed a very relevant empathy for one of Erica's characters in Joy for Beginners, Daria, who also receives a sourdough starter. And I'll just read the passage. Shit, thought Daria. She scraped the goo back into the bag, wondering what fermentation aids were lingering on the average kitchen counter, and stored the whole mess on top of the refrigerator. It sat there throughout the day, morose, guilt-inducing, occasionally emitting a small, pathetic bubble to call her attention to its fate. She'd had boyfriends who were subtler. She was about to go on a trip anyway, a weekend with a man she barely knew, the excitement of the date enough without adding the guilt bread. Maybe she could let the stuff die now. That's exactly how I thought about my sourdough the entire time. I think that is a perfect description of sourdough. And so while I didn't rise to the challenge of my sourdough starter that was gifted to me, Daria does. And the experience of making that sourdough starter just changes her dramatically. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on that as it relates to the current moment, because of course sourdough just was trending at the beginning of all of this, and who knows, maybe it'll come back in the fall. But I'm wondering, perhaps, why do you think that bread baking, specifically sourdough, was something that people really turned to maybe as a source of comfort during the pandemic?
No, I think that's really true. And I think, you know, initially when the weather was a little cooler, so it felt comforting. It felt like taking care of something, you know, and if you were gifted it, like someone says you should take care of it, then it can feel like, no, wait a minute, I got enough going on right now. There's a pandemic going. Don't make me take care of this sourdough starter. But I think if it's your idea, then it can be a pet in a way. You know, it's this living thing that you are keeping alive, and that's kind of amazing. And I think that once the weather got a little warmer, that really transitioned into people growing stuff. I mean, I'm growing tomato plants for the first time in my life.
Oh, wow.
We have all these pots on our deck away from the deer, you know, but there was this need to create food and to take care of ourselves and to be healthy in a way. And I think that had everything to do with bread. Plus, it smells really good while it's baking. So there's that part. It just makes the air feel healthy.
Yeah.
And I think that is part of it. But, you can make a lot of bread without sourdough.
Oh, I know. I made focaccia. I made like ciabatta. So many other things that were not sourdough related.
Yeah, I have a black thumb when it comes to yeast. So no, that and cakes. See, there are things I don't do.
So I wanted to talk a little bit too about your most recent book, your memoir, and it's about your current home where you're living right now in Port Townsend. I'm very jealous. That's amazing. How is writing about home and writing about the habit? How is that similar to writing about food?
Oh, sorry, you cut out for just a second. Can you say the question again?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, just wondering about, you write so much about home in your memoir. How is that similar to writing about food?
I think that goes back to the subliminal thing again.
Yeah.
That I think one of the things that I learned as we were renovating, and I've always paid attention to houses. I remember layouts way better than I remember people's faces. I mean, it just is how I'm wired. And but I've always paid attention to how those spaces make me feel and the messages that they're sending. And so I got really interested in how the spaces we live in affect who we are and who we can become. And so when I was writing House Lessons, which is the story of a renovation of a hoarder house that we bought back in 2001, had 7.5 tons of trash. It was in terrible, terrible shape, but we loved this house. It's a 4-square house, which is a really classic, generous, open kind of full 2-story house. In an otherwise a town that is full of Victorians. And so it was a very different kind of house. And it needed us to take care of it. I mean, it wasn't for sale. We weren't supposed to find it. I mean, there were so many reasons why we shouldn't have ended up with this house, and yet we did. And as we got the trash out and saw what the lines of the house were and figured out how to adapt that to our own lives, it was really a chance to kind of do a deep dive into who do we want to be? And how do we want to live? And how do we want our family to interact? And how do you make a kitchen that encourages people to come and cook with you? And how do you create a layout that, I'm a very shy person, right? But I wanted to be more social. So a 4-square layout that has these public rooms that are they kind of have half openings between each room. And so there's this logical flow between each room. And yet it's not a huge great room, right? Shy people, great rooms, not a good combo because we go into the corner because we're scared, right?
Yeah.
But these rooms in a 4-square where you're going from one to the next and you feel as if you're constantly being both held and invited. And so for a shy person, it's a great, great place to be social. And I knew that when I saw it, and I thought, okay, I'm going to teach myself how to have parties. My house is going to help me do this. And it does. It's incredible.
Amazing. I love that. I love that idea of, I had a conversation with an architect a few years back, and he said something interesting where it was so many people just so many people just take up space in their homes and very few people inhabit them or really live in them. And I think that's exactly what you're describing there. You sort of saw this challenge of this home where the structure of it was very in tune with how you wanted your life to be there. Yeah.
And I think it's the difference between, owner and object and partners. I really feel like I'm a partner with my house, and my house is helping me be a better person, and I helped it by saving it, basically. But we worked together to make a better, more beautiful house, and it worked.
Yeah, Christine just dropped a note in the chats noting that I am currently house hunting in Portland, so I am taking note right now. I am.
Yeah. And that's something that I tell people when they're house hunting. You'll probably fall in love with a house that has nothing to do with what you said you wanted, and that's fine. That's really typical. We were looking for land when we found our house, so you end up with something you don't expect at all. But I also encourage people, instead of getting locked into X number of bedrooms, X number of bathrooms, think about how you live, where you spend your time, who you want to be. Like,
Yeah.
is it important to you to have people over to gather? All right, so maybe living rooms are more important. I have a friend who they just designed a house. They've got 2 young boys. They wanted to make sure that they stayed a really tight family. So they designed the bedrooms to be quite small and the living room space to be bigger and comfortable so that it becomes kind of the piazza. It's the gathering spot, right? And so you can really, you can encourage yourself to be creative by making sure there's a space that has light, has windows, has, is separate if you need it. You can encourage yourself to, you can encourage each other to be a good couple by having a little nook where you drink coffee in the morning, where it invites you to sit down together. So if you think about your house as a series of invitations and what it's inviting you to do, that's a really great way to interact with your house.
I'm going to be making a vision board after this conversation.
There you go. There you go. Oh, and someone's saying they want to see before-after pictures of the house. So there's a Seattle Times article. If you Google Seattle Times and Bauermeister and or house lessons, there is an article with beautiful pictures, and there's before and after pictures there.
Very fun. I need to see those. I haven't seen those yet. So bringing it back to food, I want to talk about food and our memories about food and sort of the role of nostalgia in it. And just saying that like eating can be, as you've described, just this very inherently social act. And it can also help us to cement a connection to shared memories of moments around the table. And it's an elusive feeling. It's one that's really challenging to describe, but you do exactly that in your books. And there's this consistent theme of memory and how the stories of the past are conjured up by food and by our senses. I'm curious if you think that it's the food, what is being served at the table, or rather the practice of gathering around that food that's more important in sort of creating this shared sense of belonging.
Good question. It's interesting because when School of Essential Ingredients first came out, people said, "Where's the restaurant? I want to go to the restaurant." A lot of people thought it was Chez Panisse, and I had never even seen Chez Panisse, and it actually looks very similar.
Yeah,
it's not Chez Panisse. But people would say, "Where's the restaurant? I want to go." And I said, the restaurant to me is not a place. It's that evening when you're in a place where the light is just right and the temperature is just right and the people around the table are settling into those conversations that go beyond the ordinary, and the food is arriving at just the right time, and it's the kind of food that makes you stop talking and just think for a minute. And it's that kind of, it's like the equivalent of golden light, but for food and people. And that's what I wanted the book to feel like, was that kind of coming together and that elusive, incredible moment when food and people and location interact.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. I didn't think it was Chez Panisse, though. My mind definitely went there when I read School of Essential Ingredients for the first time. But I think rather than being so fixated upon like trying to make it this concrete physical place that I was familiar with, it instead sort of by your description felt like just this magical restaurant that's sort of this combination and culmination of all of the most amazing meals I've ever had.
Exactly. That's what I wanted it to feel like.
I love that. So I have one more question. I wanted to talk to you about the act of preparing our food and how that plays into the experience of a meal. I'm wondering how you're sort of seeing our shifting food culture. There's so many meal delivery services, and there's this heavy reliance upon takeout, and then obviously everything that's going on in the pandemic and all of people's shifting food practices with all of that. And there's just this really increased distance between what we eat and how it's made. How do you see all of that as sort of impacting the role that nostalgia plays in how we eat?
Although I also think that people are eating home more than they have in a decade.
True.
So the food is coming in, but you're plating it yourself. You're eating in your own house. And I think people are cooking a lot more. Yeah. I know that for us, because for the first time ever, really, we knew we were going to be home all summer. And so we signed up for CSA.
Mhm.
And so now every week we get these vegetables I have never cooked with before. And it has completely changed how we eat. And I've been forced to be really creative, and we are eating such healthy food. It's coming within, it comes from within 5 miles of our house.
Wow.
And so we've been using the farmer's market, and we can actually order online from the farmer's market, and it's there when you go to pick it up. And so what I see is actually people having a much more intimate relationship with their food. What they're missing probably is those larger gatherings, and the 6 people around a restaurant table, or the 8 people around your dinner table. But I think that hopefully we'll come back with some of those skills and be able to have those dinners in our house.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that answer. Your answer was so much more optimistic than my question.
Well, I'm trying, man. You got to just hang in there.
No, absolutely. I actually picked up my CSA right before this conversation. I am totally in the same situation that you are, and I'm getting all of these things that I have absolutely never cooked with before, but that's forcing me to sort of get out of my comfort zone and make these meals that I've never even considered making before. And it's its own sort of inspiration, which is so fun.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we have become like the Kohlrabi queens. I mean, it's just amazing.
I feel like that is Kohlrabi and maybe a couple others where I'm not. What did you do with that? I'm curious.
I know. It's like Kohlrabi is great in coleslaw. It's great straight. It's great in salads. Man, you can eat that sucker anywhere. But I didn't know. It's kind of like a Northwestern jicama, and it always looked so odd when I saw it at the farmer's market, and I wasn't willing to. I mean, you'd think I should experiment because I research food, but and so it's been great,
Yeah.
I feel like I'm very late to that CSA party, but it was mostly because we traveled so much, and it just didn't make any sense. So there are some upsides of being stuck at home.
Absolutely. I mean, it's my first year doing one, and I think it's many people's first year, so I wouldn't say you're late to the game at all. So it looks like we have a question in the Ask a Question box. Do you have a favorite recipe that you've written about?
That I've written about? Well, actually, if you go to the website, each of those recipes includes, they were originally written as guest blog posts on various blogs. And so there's always a story that goes along with the recipe. And so that was fun. In terms of School of Essential Ingredients, I think the 2 that were the most satisfying to write as stories were probably Tom's pasta sauce, because it dovetailed so beautifully into his personal story. And then also the baking the cake, because again, I had no idea how the steps of baking a cake would fit a marriage. I mean, it just came together. Although Ian's tiramisu was really fun because I had to make up my own recipe. And so we had this great tiramisu tasting where we had all the different kinds of liquor. And so each one was in this fancy cup, and there was rum, and there were all these different things. And so we would pass them around. This is pre-pandemic, obviously, because we're all putting our same spoons in. But we all would taste, and then we all had a little sheet of paper, and we got to write down which one we liked the best. And that was really fun. That was a good party.
Which one was your favorite?
The one that ended up in the book. So that recipe's on the website too.
Nice.
It's a riff off the Mario Batali recipe, but it has its own little things.
Well, I think those were all of my questions tonight. I can invite Christine back to the screen. Christine, if you want to come up, there she is.
Hi, I love this so much because I love talking about food, and food as ritual, and food as medicine, and I'm getting teary. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's because we haven't been able to eat together. But this was so amazing. And I am so appreciative, Erica, that you could join us. I hope someday when we can have Cookbook Club, you'll come on down.
That would be wonderful. And I really want to thank you for, I'm sure everybody that's watching is a great fan of your bookstore, but, the independent bookstores are they are just so extraordinary, and I hope everyone out there is supporting the heck out of them. You know, I would not still be writing if the independent bookstores hadn't picked up School of Essential Ingredients and put it in the hands of book club members, you know, and put it in the hands of their readers and said, you need to read this book. This is a good book. Because, you know, there's so many books out there, and it's the indie bookstores that really curate, and they know their readers, and they are community hubs. And I you know, when I saw the pandemic coming, it's like, no, not the bookstores. We saved the bookstores first, you know. And I just love how people have rallied around. And I hope that all of you out there will continue to do that, because these are really important cultural hubs for us.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, it's been hard to keep people connected. You know, I am a little bit worried about our senior population that used to come into the store, and they don't like to do video. They technology, they just can't do it. So I worry about them as a community person, but hopefully somebody's keeping in touch with them. Yeah. Anyway,
and you know what? Let me throw this out there. If there are any of you that want to do this, this is something that I'm doing with my father-in-law. He really likes poetry, and so I bought him Mary Oliver's Devotions collection for his birthday. And probably 4 or 5 days a week, I call him, and for half an hour, we read poetry to each other. And it is an amazing experience. I thought I was doing it for him, and after about 5 days, it's like, nah, I'm doing it for me. You know, it's particularly if you have an older person in your life, it is a great way to track how they're thinking, how they're doing, if they are reading. If you trade off reading the poems, it's a great way to track how their cognition is doing. It also is a thing to look forward to. It's also, I mean, I don't know about you, but there's not much exciting happening in my life. And so if I call my father-in-law every day, it's like, what did you eat for lunch? I mean, there's just not that much to talk about. And so if you have a focus like that, and if you don't want to do poetry, you could read a chapter of a book, you know, but, you know, and I do know, I've talked to a couple book clubs that are multi-generational book clubs within the same family. They've started since the pandemic started as a way to have something to talk about. And so they pick a book, they all read it, they invite the author whenever they can. And, you know, I'm there, there's Grammy, you know, and there's all the way down to the grandchildren. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to do. So
yeah, I think the art of reading aloud is hopefully coming back, but it's had a backseat, and I love reading aloud. I think it's a very important part of how we learn, how we, you know, it's sensual, not, you know, it's our senses. So I think that's a great idea. And I just thought of something that I might be able to institute. So thank you for that idea. Because we do have a Two Rivers book club, and we do have some senior members. And I think if we could do a phone tree, maybe.
Oh, I love that.
Phone tree. Yeah. I don't know. But enough. I put some links in the chat for everybody. You can buy Erica's books from Two Rivers. You can also go to her site and view her recipes. I also put the article about her house in the chat. So feel free. The reason we use Crowdcast is because it actually records our events, so you can share them after the fact, share them with your friends. Christina Moss, who is one of our dear supporters, is totally up for reading the senior. So
I love that.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, they just don't want to do technology. So thank you, friend. Yeah, so I guess we're at 7:24. We'll just wrap it up. Thank you. I love that this series came together so well. And Isabel, really, she did all the work.
Well, she did a beautiful job.
I was packing books, and she did everything else. So.
Oh, and I just want to mention, buy all the books through Two Rivers. But the hard part is I can't sign in person during a pandemic, but I am happy to send readers signed book plates.
Yep.
So you can find me through my email address, which is also on my website through the contact. And you can just write me and say, hey, I bought my book through Two Rivers. Send me a book plate. And I'm happy to do it. So.
Amazing.
Or Erica, you could just send me 5 or 6.
Happy to.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That would be great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and have a good night. And I look forward to tomorrow and Jamie Curl and really fattening deliciousness.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.